Okay, so let's get started. These are the Ruger Vaqueros single action cowboy guns, the replicas of the Colt 45, originally designed and commissioned by the United States Army in 1870. These are replicas from the 1990s. What we're doing today is we're going to be changing out the hammer, and we're going to lighten up the mainspring a little bit. So I've done this to two of the three Vaqueros already that I've been asked to modify. What I want to show you here is the old hammer and then the new hammer that we're going to be installing. You can see that it's got a much higher profile than the new hammer, which has got a much lower profile. It's much easier to get your thumb on it to pull it back, single action. And then the thickness of it as well. It's about twice as wide, so it's got a lot more room for your thumb. Somebody with a smaller hand, or in this case, the individual is missing part of his thumb, and he has a little bit of trouble actually pulling back on the hammer spur. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch this out. Now, I've already completed two of these. Here's one of the guns that I've already switched out. You can see the new hammer, and this is one we're going to switch out today. So the first thing we want to do is open the loading gate, and let's look in there, make sure that we have an empty firearm, and this one is confirmed empty. All cylinders empty. The one that we need to be working on, let's open up that gate and look in the cylinder, spin the cylinder, and we can see that there are no cartridges in there. Both of these are empty and safe to work on. So single action, obviously pull a hammer back, pull the trigger. Like I said, with this higher profile, sometimes it's more difficult to reach your thumb way up there and actually pull this down. And then we're going to lighten the mainspring as well. So I tested these before. On this firearm, the trigger pull was, the hammer pull was 7.6 pounds. We put a lighter mainspring or hammer spring in here, and we brought it down to 4.6 pounds. The one that we're going to be working on today has a pull of about 8.6 pounds. We're going to lighten up this one quite a bit more. I've got a shorter mainspring and a lighter mainspring. It might be too light, and we may have to switch it out later. But to switch out the hammer spring or the mainspring, they're the same thing, is fairly easy in one of these Rugers. So you can get the parts readily online. These are Wolf springs. The kit comes with a mainspring, a trigger spring, and then a barrel stop spring. We're not going to worry. This particular person does not want to lighten the trigger spring. The trigger pull right now is only 3.6. It is a very light trigger, and there's really, to me, there's no reason to lighten up the barrel stop spring. So, or the cylinder stop spring. So we're not going to be doing that. We're just going to be focused on the mainspring and the hammer. And as simple as that may sound, you have to break this firearm completely down. It has to come 100% apart. You have to take the cylinder out. You have to break the gun apart. The pawl has to come out. The transfer bar has to come out. And then there's a couple of small springs in there you got to be really careful about. I'll point those out as we get to them. But like I said, these are Wolf. Midway USA offers the hammers and the spring kits. Brownells also offers them. You can find them varying degrees of pricing, $27.82 typically 27, 28, 29, 30 bucks. I'm finding for the spring kits, and about 36 to 40 bucks for the new hammer. So somewhere in that $50 range, you can really make your Vaquero much easier to handle. So why don't we get started? So as we're getting started, one more thing. I have these magnetic trays, 2 rectangular ones and 2 circular ones. Hornady professional tools, not necessarily for gunsmithing, but any type of project you're doing with small parts, screws, springs, things like that. These come in great. I don't know, I found this online. I probably paid 15 or 20 bucks for it, but it really comes in handy as you're starting to take parts out. You can sort of keep them in order. You don't lose anything. Like I said, they're magnetic. Stuff sticks to them very well. Love to use this. And then over here I do have another mat where I can, a nice rubber mat with some magnets in it where I can keep parts as well. So let's get going. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the handles off. So this one screw goes all the way through, holds on both of the handles. We'll get that guy out of there. There, the handle on the back side just fell out. Usually you got to work these out a little bit, but that one came right out. So did this one, almost as if it was apart before. We're going to put those aside. Here's a main spring that I'm talking about. The easiest way to get this out is you want to cock the firearm, and underneath the seat is a hole, and I will take a roll punch and actually stick it through this hole below the seat, and then uncock the firearm, and that loosens up the mainspring. Sitting right here, kind of hard to see. I'll bring it up to the camera. This is actually the trigger spring, and it just hooks on this little knob right here. It's on both sides. We're going to take the screwdriver and just very easily work that off. Should pop right out. Of course, this one's giving me a little trouble. There we go. That one's out. We'll lose that. Make sure you pop it out on the other side. That gives us a little bit of play in the hammer spur and the mainspring. And if you just kind of work your way up a little bit, you'll be able to spring is fighting me just a little bit. Not much, just a touch. Sometimes if you have the roll pin in there too far, it'll get caught. Get this base plate just gonna fight me a little bit today. Can't quite get it over the trigger spring. There we go. Well, still that. Honestly, this one's fought me about the worst of the 3 so far. Shouldn't really take this much to get it out. There we go. Okay, and then remember which way this actually came out. So there's a slight curve here and a hook up toward the front. This goes toward the front of the firearm. I would say, here, it's kind of hard to see. Let me bring it up toward the camera. But you can see right here, this little notch right here actually goes toward the barrel or the front of the gun. I tell people all the time, let's set this aside. Take pictures when you're doing this. Take pictures of everything you're doing. If you're unsure, take a picture as a reminder. I'm shooting video as a reminder, but I still do like to take pictures just in case I have to refer back to something. I think it's always a good idea. Now, the frame itself is held together by 5 screws. There's 2 screws here in the bottom, and these are both basically 2 different size screws, so you really don't want to mix these up. I'll start with the 2 screws in the back of the gun. Let's get these out. Oh, we got to get the right screwdriver. I'll tell you, if you're going to start working on firearms, go out and get yourself at least a basic smithing kit. Has a lot of different screwdriver heads in here. And you always want to make sure that the head is fitting the screw perfectly, so you don't strip it out. So we've got the right screwdriver head in there now, and we've got these screws loose. So these are going to come right out. There's one, almost out. And it goes into, this one's going to go into the metal tray in the back. That's screw number 1 on the left side of the gun. Screw number 2. That next to it, that's on the right side of the gun. Now, the 2 underneath, this one is the longer of the 2 screws. And it's really important that you get this one back in its correct spot, or your gun will not function. You can see that's a much longer screw. That goes on the left side right there. You've got another different type of screw. It's a different size, different length. It's not as long as the one we just took out. That one goes on the right side. You can see, again, it's a little bit longer than the other 2 screws. And then there's one final screw here in the front. And once we take that out, the frame is actually going to split and come apart. So this is where you want to be a little bit careful. There are a couple of springs in here. There is a cylinder stop spring. That screw to the front. There's another spring. Right here at the back of the gun. We're going to take this out. Spring and plunger, we're going to put that aside, and then on top of right here, on top of the bottom part of the frame right here, this is your cylinder stop spring and plunger. We're going to take that out too so we don't lose it. And then we are going to have to take out the trigger spring in order to put the gun back together. At some point you have to take it out, so we may as well just take it out now. Really, you can see how easy that was. I pushed the pin. I'm going to put that in a separate container over here. here. That's the pin for the trigger spring. And then we're going to put the trigger spring in that same metal tray. And there you've got the lower frame completely disassembled at this point. So the springs that we did take out is the hammer, spring, and plunger. The plunger goes in just above where the screw fits. So as we put the gun back together, we're going to have to be careful with that spring, and then the cylinder stop spring, which goes in the lower frame. Next thing we have to do, we're going to open the loading gate, and we're going to actually take the cylinder out. Cylinder actually will come right out, and we're going to put that aside. Now, and this is going to be the tricky part as we put it back together. So there's a spring here which sits on and holds the trigger spring in place. It also holds the loading gate in place, and this one's tripped me up a couple times. It's been really hard to figure out. It's already slipped out of place since I've actually pulled the cylinder out. You can see that it's dropped out of place, and there's no longer, you really can't open the gate, and there's no pressure on the gate. But the next pin that we're going to have to get out right now is a trigger pin, and once we do that, everything basically falls out. The cylinder, the cylinder stop is going to fall out, the pawl is going to fall out, and the transfer bar is all going to fall out at the same time. They're all kind of locked together right in here, and that's a challenge with really the trigger job on this. You can't just take the trigger out at this, or the hammer out at this point, because everything kind of fits together and drops into place. So you have to really have to take it all apart. So let me get my smithing block. Okay, got a little smithing block here, and what we're going to do is get a roll punch and see if we've taken enough pressure off the spring to get it out. We have not, so that's where this gets a little bit tricky. So this spring right here there's a notch. There's a notch inside, right inside here on the trigger, on the trigger pin, and this spring will actually lock onto that notch. So we're going to have to move the camera a little bit, get it over to the gun vise, because I don't have three hands. My gun vise is my third hand. Let's get it over there. Okay, so we're in the vise, and what we're going to do now is we've got to put some pressure on this spring here. It's this one right here. So this is the same spring that holds the loading gate, and it holds the trigger pin in place. And they actually make a tool for this. Honestly, I don't think you need the tool. I think if you just can get enough pressure on this spring, it's got a little groove in it where the spring seats. You get enough pressure on there, you can typically just get the trigger spring to pop right out of there. I've done it with all three of these so far. Exactly this way. I'll try a little bit bigger of a. There you can see I'm taking some tension off. Not quite. There it goes. Just enough. Now you got to be careful because this is really going to pop right out. Let me get another punch in there. We're gonna push that trigger pin just a little bit, and as you see, it's gonna work the trigger a little bit. It's gonna come right out for you like that. Now that's a little notch I was talking about, and that's where the trigger pin spring sits, right in there. So when we're putting it back together, there's an audible snap when that goes back together. Let's keep that over with the trigger, and Here's the part where everything comes apart. Oh, we got one more pin. We do have to get the hammer pin out, and at this point there should be no pressure. It should come right out, and it does. And you can see it's also notched. So this notch goes to the left hand side of the gun. Very important that it goes back in exactly the way it came out. Now our entire action is free. So in here is our transfer bar, our pawl, our trigger, and our hammer. And it all kind of comes out as one unit. There is the trigger. There's our transfer bar. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we put the gun back together. But this is what prevents an accidental discharge. If you drop the gun, the hammer will never actually physically touch the firing pin, which would then hit the primer and igniter round should you drop it. So this was a new invention. They didn't have these back in the 1850s. A lot of times cowboys would they would leave that first cylinder unloaded in case they did drop it to prevent an accidental discharge. But this invention, the transfer bar, is excellent. It prevents accidental discharges. And then also we have the pawl, which is what spins a cylinder. Every time you pull the hammer back, this is the part that actually spins a cylinder. We'll put that over here, and then here's our old trigger, our old skinny high-profile trigger that we're going to be replacing. And in here we have yet one more pin, and we have a pin and plunger and spring that this pin is holding in place. We're going to have to take that out because we have to put this into the new hammer. Alright, so let's get the camera moved back where it belongs. Okay, so what I normally do is I'll take a pair of pliers, push down a little bit on the spring. We're going to get this pin out of there, and you can see it released all the tension. There's our block, and there is our mainspring. And this is the one we're changing out for the new mainspring. Now the tricky part is getting the new one back in place. And that is usually where my trusty assistant Scott comes into play. Because while I'm pushing down on the spring, oh, it looks like, oh boy, this is going to be a little bit easier than I thought. I can actually do that by hand. I can get the pin back into the hole and lock everything in place, and there we go. We've just switched out the mainspring. So a lot of times I need a third set of hands to help me do that. Like I said, we're going with a little bit lighter spring this time. Let's hope it's not too light and we don't have to change it out. But I was able to actually use my fingers to put pressure on the base and get the pin back in here. So now we're actually ready to completely put the gun back together. Okay, so here's a part that's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle. Here's your trigger. Here's your transfer bar, goes right here. Here's your new hammer. Here's your new hammer, and the pawl sips in this bottom notch here. And the challenge is this kind of all goes together at the same time, with the hammer going in slightly ahead of the trigger and transfer bar. And there you go, it's all pretty much in place and seated. I'm not going to let go. What I do want to do is line up the hole for the hammer so we can get the pin in place and really start holding everything in place. Now remember, the notch goes to the left side of the gun, which looks like the right side of the gun now because it's upside down. the hole lined up, and there it slips right in. And that's the most important part right there, because once you get that hammer pin back in place, everything's pretty much set, and you don't have to worry about the pawl or the transfer bar slipping out at this point. So the next thing we have to do is our trigger spring and the cylinder stop. Cylinder stop has got a little notch, fits inside here, so again, two things at once. They sort of slip in place right here. Now, this could be a gotcha moment. This is where you have to be very careful about the trigger pin spring not slipping off the gate load, because this spring is dual purpose. So the loading gate uses a spring for tension, and there's also tension on the trigger pin. So remember the notch we talked about earlier? There's a notch we talked about earlier that this spring will sit on, and a lot of times by hand, you know, if we come from the back side, sometimes it's easier. It really depends on how tight the trigger spring is. But we're going to wiggle that pin into place as far as we possibly can. It's going to actually hold the trigger and the cylinder stop, and now we're up to the actual spring here. So one of the things I found, you can put some pressure. Put some pressure on the top of the spring here, but it's not always quite enough. So what I discovered through trial and error is to actually get a pin inside where the trigger pin is going to go, and try to keep enough pressure. That one slipped. Keep enough pressure to get the trigger spring to seat, and it's just, I can see it's just about there, not quite. It's gonna fight me, and I'm trying to put a little pressure right inside here. No, it's gonna fight me. It's gonna fight me. There we go. Let's see if I can, nope, it popped out on me. So it is a little bit of trial and error. I gotta be honest with you. This is the third one I've done. I've done it 3 different ways. That's all the way down. Now we gotta get the, oh my Lord. I had it that time. Patience, 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 patience. No, just doesn't want to come in. All right, give me a second. Okay, so off camera, I did something a little bit different. I was struggling getting the pin all the way through. Sometimes if you push the trigger pin spring down, you can almost work the pin in, and that's exactly what I did. So we're going to go in from the other direction and work our way back through, going backwards, and you can see it sliding in. You'll hear a snap. There, right there, you heard the snap. So now we have that spring. It's the gate loading, the loading gate spring, the trigger pin spring, everything's in place. This is where you want to be careful. So I've had this problem before where this spring pops out of place. So what I'm going to want to try to do is very carefully get this out of here and hold everything together so that spring doesn't pop out. And right now it's looking good. So I'm going to get the camera moved back over here to the main workbench, and we're going to show you how to put this all back together. Okay, so now we're going to do our final reassembly. Here's your cylinder stop spring. Put that back in place. Then we have our pawl spring and plunger. That goes back in the frame. Make sure you don't put it in the screw hole. Plunger first. Now we're going to actually reassemble the frame. And make sure that the springs stay in their correct locations. They did. That was very simple. So the best thing to do at this point is just get the front screw back in so you can hold the frame together. And give that a twist or two. And we should hopefully be on easy street at this point. Everything is in place. We don't really want to start working on anything mechanical till we get all the screws back in place, we get the cylinder back in place, and then we'll start to test it. So remember, the long bolt goes on the left side of the gun, right there. The second longer bolt goes on the right side of the gun underneath the frame. Let's put those in place. I know it's pretty boring watching me put screws in. So I'm going to cut it here, and I'm going to put the remaining 2 screws in the back of the frame, and then I'll catch back up to you. Okay, all the screws are back in. The next thing we have to do is get the trigger spring back in place, which is fairly simple to line up. Get the holes lined up. Get your pin ready. Should just slip right in. Work it all the way in, and there you go. Your trigger spring is now in place. The final 2 pieces of the reassembly, we have to really continue to watch this loading gate because we don't want the trigger pin spring to pop out there. You can get it back in without taking it apart, but it does become a little bit of a pain in the butt. Remember, the notch goes to the front, and it actually seats right here on the hammer. So we came out from the top direction. We want to get it in between the trigger springs, and then what we want to try to do is work it up in there and get the seat up into place. Which really shouldn't be that difficult with all the tension on the spring at the moment. Is it seating properly? Yep, you can see that it's seating properly right here. Definitely had a little bit of a struggle getting the seat out, so I'm not surprised we're struggling a little bit getting it back in. Honestly, it should just drop right in place, but it's not. Almost there. Almost there. It is there. We got that in place. Perfect. So what we want to do is let's get the trigger springs back on their pins. Here's one side, and here's the other side. And that really goes on easy. Just take the screwdriver and hook it right over the pin. Unless, of course, it wants to fight you. There we go. It's in place. The seat's in place. At this point, what we want to do is we want to actually cock the hammer back. There we go. And pull our pin out to put pressure back on the mainspring, and we're more or less done at this point. Okay, so everything's back together. Loading gate functioning correctly. Hammer's coming back. The transfer bar is not going to come all the way up yet until the cylinder's back in place. So the final steps are to get the cylinder back in place. We'll test all the components, put the handles on, and we are done. Go. Close the loading gate. There we go. Cylinder locks nice and tight the way it should. Transfer bar is working correctly. Hammer's working correctly. Rotating correctly. Loading gate's open. Cylinder's turning correctly. Let's get these handles back on. This time, I'm gonna make you watch me put a screw in. All right. There we are. Everything working perfectly. Loading gate open, cylinder spinning, won't backspin, cylinder stop is working correctly. Okay, so everything's working perfectly. That is how you switch out the hammer on a Ruger Vaquero. Okay, final thing we're going to do, we are going to test the pull on the new hammer. It says 7.3. Highly doubt that. It says 10.2. Highly doubt that. There we go. 2.6. That's what I'm expecting. 2.11. 1.4. 6.3. That's really where you're pulling from. Okay, we're averaging about 2.8 trigger pulls. So where did we start out on this guy? We started out at 8.6. We're at 2.8. That's the lightest of the trigger pulls of the three that I've done. So like I said, that spring was a little bit shorter. That mainspring was a little bit shorter and a little bit lighter than the other two, so I fully expected it to come out a little bit lighter than the other two. We've got to get into the range and make sure it's not too light, that it's actually got enough power to fire a round.